this war, if you understand the geography, if you understand the economics behind it, then you will realize that the conflict between Iran and Israel is not simply another regional war in the Middle East. It is not just about missiles or bombs or ideology. What is actually happening is something much larger. This war is fundamentally about the global financial system. It is about the system that has governed the world economy for more than half a century. And if this system breaks, the entire global order that we know today will change. Now, let me start with a very simple idea. Whenever people watch the news, they tend to focus on the visible things. They look at the missiles flying through the air. They look at the explosions on television. They look at the political speeches, and they think that those things are the real story. But in geopolitics, the visible things are almost never the real story. The real story is always beneath the surface. The real story is about incentives. It is about economic structures. It is about geography. And once you understand those deeper forces, the war suddenly begins to make sense. So when people ask the question, why is this war happening now? The answer is not simply that these countries hate each other. Countries have hated each other throughout history. Hatred alone does not start wars. Wars start when strategic systems begin to break. And what we are witnessing right now is the potential breaking point of one of the most powerful systems ever created in modern history. That system is called the petrodollar system. Now, before we go deeper into the war, I want you to understand something about empires. Empires are not sustained by armies alone. A lot of people think that the power of the United States comes purely from its military strength. They think it is about aircraft carriers, fighter jets, nuclear weapons, and all of these sophisticated technologies. And yes, the United States has an incredibly powerful military, but military power alone cannot sustain a global empire for decades. There must be an economic system behind it. There must be a financial structure that allows that military to exist in the first place. In the case of the United States, that system revolves around oil. Oil is still the most important commodity in the world economy. Every major industrial country depends on it. Every transportation system depends on it. Every modern economy depends on it. And for decades, the global oil trade has been organized around one currency. That currency is the United States dollar. Now think about what that means for a moment. If every country in the world needs oil, and if oil is sold in dollars, then every country in the world must hold dollars in order to buy that oil. That creates constant global demand for the dollar. And that demand is what allows the United States to maintain its economic power. It is what allows it to borrow enormous amounts of money. It is what allows it to finance its military. And it is what allows it to maintain influence across the globe. But this system did not appear naturally. It was built deliberately through alliances in the Middle East. In particular, it was built through partnerships with the oil-producing states in the Persian Gulf. These states agreed to sell their oil in dollars, and in return, they received security protection from the United States. So the relationship was very simple. The Gulf countries provided the oil. The United States provided the military protection. And together, they created the financial backbone of the global economy. Now, this is where things start to get interesting, because when you look at the current war between Iran and Israel, you begin to realize that the conflict is not only about those two countries. The real battlefield is actually the broader Gulf region. The real targets are the economic hubs that make the petrodollar system possible. And that is why we are seeing attacks not only against Israel, but also against the Gulf states themselves. For example, consider cities like Dubai or countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar. These places are not simply wealthy cities in the desert. They are actually critical nodes in the global financial system. They are where oil wealth is concentrated. They are where massive financial investments flow into global markets. And for decades, these economies have thrived under the security umbrella of the United States. Take Dubai as an example. Dubai built its entire model on stability and global trust. Wealthy foreigners moved there because it was safe. Businesses moved there because it was stable. Investors moved their money there because they believed the region was protected by American military power. But the moment that war begins to threaten that stability, the entire economic model starts to shake, because the wealth that flows into these cities depends entirely on the perception of security. Now imagine that perception collapsing. Imagine that investors suddenly believe that missiles could strike the Gulf at any time. Imagine that wealthy expatriates decide that the region is no longer safe for their families or their money. The economic consequences would be enormous. Capital would flee, businesses would relocate, and the entire financial ecosystem built around the petrodollar would begin to weaken. This brings us to one of the most important strategic decisions made by Iran in this war. Instead of focusing purely on direct military confrontation with the United States, Iran has chosen to attack the economic foundations of the American system. In other words, this is not simply a military war, it is an economic war. And once you understand that logic, the Iranian strategy suddenly makes sense. The goal is not necessarily to defeat the United States on a traditional battlefield. The goal is to destabilize the economic system that sustains American power. And the easiest way to do that is by targeting the Gulf economies that support the petrodollar. But the strategy goes even deeper than that. Because when we talk about the Gulf region, we are really talking about one of the most important geographic choke points in the entire world. And that choke point is called the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is not a very large area. In some places, it is only a few dozen kilometers wide. But despite its small size, it is one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway. That means a huge portion of the global energy system depends on this single geographic location. Think about what that means for countries in Asia. Countries like India, China, Japan, and South Korea rely heavily on oil shipments that travel through this route. If that route were disrupted, the consequences would spread across the entire global economy. And this is precisely why the Strait of Hormuz plays such a central role in the current conflict. Because geography gives Iran a very unique strategic advantage. On one side of the strait, you have the Gulf states, which are largely flat desert regions with exposed infrastructure. On the other side, you have Iran, which is dominated by mountains. Those mountains provide natural cover for missile bases, drone facilities, and military installations. From those mountain positions, Iran can launch attacks against the Gulf region while remaining extremely difficult to strike in return. In other words, geography allows Iran to project offensive power while maintaining a defensive fortress. And that geographic reality shapes the entire logic of the war. So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, we begin to see that this conflict is not just about Iran and Israel. It is about the stability of the Gulf economies. It is about the control of global energy routes. And most importantly, it is about the financial system that has sustained the American empire for decades. And that is why I began today's lecture by saying that the world after this war may look very different from the world before it. Because if the petrodollar system begins to break, the consequences will extend far beyond the Middle East. They will reshape the global economy itself. Now, there is another aspect of this war that many people still do not fully understand, and it has to do with the economics of weapons themselves. When we think about military power, we usually imagine the most advanced technology. We imagine stealth aircraft, complex missile defense systems, satellites, and extremely expensive weapons platforms. And for decades, this is exactly how the military of the United States has been designed. It was built during the era after the Cold War, where the competition between great powers focused on technological sophistication. The assumption was that whoever built the most advanced and expensive systems would dominate the battlefield. But the conflict we are witnessing today looks very different. What we are seeing is a type of warfare where extremely cheap weapons are challenging extremely expensive defensive systems. And this is where the math of war becomes very important. Imagine that you have a drone that costs around $50,000 to produce. It is a relatively simple machine. It carries a small explosive payload, and it can be launched from hundreds of kilometers away. Now imagine that this drone is heading toward a major piece of infrastructure. In order to stop it, the defending side launches an interceptor missile. That interceptor missile can cost millions of dollars, sometimes even tens of millions, depending on the system being used. Now you begin to see the problem. The attacker is spending a tiny fraction of the cost of the defender. And this imbalance is not theoretical. We are already seeing examples of it on the battlefield. There have been situations where a single incoming missile or drone triggers multiple interceptor launches. In some cases, you might see 10 or even 11 defensive missiles fired at a single target. Each interceptor represents a huge financial cost. The attacker, meanwhile, can produce drones and missiles much more cheaply and in larger numbers. Over time, this becomes a war of attrition. It becomes a question of who can sustain the economic burden of the conflict longer. This is why the Iranian strategy relies so heavily on relatively inexpensive weapons. Instead of trying to match the United States or Israel aircraft for aircraft, they focus on drones, ballistic missiles, and other systems that can be produced at a fraction of the cost. In economic terms, it is an extremely effective strategy. If the attacker spends $50,000 and forces the defender to spend $10 million to stop it, the attacker is winning the economic exchange every single time. And when you extend that logic across hundreds or even thousands of attacks, the financial pressure becomes enormous. Defense systems begin to run out of interceptors. Supply chains struggle to keep up with demand. Governments start to worry about the cost of replacing every missile that is fired. Over time, the imbalance begins to expose weaknesses in the entire military structure. This brings us to the deeper issue of military doctrine. The doctrine of the United States Armed Forces was developed during a very different era of warfare. During the Cold War, the primary objective was to demonstrate technological superiority over rival powers. That meant building the most advanced aircraft, the most complex missile defense systems, and the most sophisticated military hardware imaginable. Enormous resources were invested in research and development. The result was a military that is incredibly powerful but also extremely expensive to maintain. The problem is that modern conflicts do not always reward expensive complexity. Sometimes they reward simplicity and scale. A small drone built with commercially available components can threaten infrastructure worth billions of dollars. A relatively inexpensive missile can force an entire air defense system into action. When the defender must spend vastly more money than the attacker for every engagement, the strategic balance begins to shift. So what we are witnessing is the puncturing of a certain perception that has surrounded American power for decades. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a widespread belief that the United States possessed overwhelming and unchallengeable military superiority. That belief became part of the psychological foundation of global politics. Countries assumed that American military systems were essentially unbeatable. But conflicts like this one reveal that even the most advanced military can face serious difficulties when confronted with new forms of asymmetric warfare. At the same time, the targets chosen in this conflict are not random. They are carefully selected to maximize pressure on the economic systems of the Gulf region. Consider the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. This group includes nations such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar. These countries play a central role in the global energy market and in the financial structures connected to the petrodollar system. But despite their wealth, these states have certain vulnerabilities that are often overlooked. One of the most significant vulnerabilities involves something very basic: water. Much of the Gulf region consists of desert environments where natural freshwater resources are extremely limited. Large cities with millions of people can only exist because of advanced infrastructure that produces drinking water from the sea. These facilities are known as desalination plants. Desalination plants take seawater and use industrial processes to remove the salt, turning it into fresh water that can be used by the population. In many Gulf countries, these plants provide the majority of the available water supply. In some cases, they supply around 60% of all drinking water. Without them, large urban populations would face immediate shortages. Now think about how vulnerable such infrastructure can be during a war. A desalination facility is a fixed location. It cannot be easily moved. It requires large industrial structures and continuous energy supply to function. That means it can become a strategic target. A drone or missile strike against such a facility could interrupt water production for millions of people. Even temporary disruptions could create severe problems for cities that rely heavily on these plants. Energy infrastructure is another critical target. Oil fields, pipelines, and export terminals form the backbone of the Gulf economies. These installations are spread across large areas of open desert. Protecting every piece of infrastructure across such vast distances is extremely difficult. A single successful strike can disrupt production, damage facilities, or create uncertainty in global energy markets. And this brings us back to the logic of economic warfare. The objective is not necessarily to destroy every facility permanently. The objective is to create uncertainty and instability. Investors begin to question whether the region remains safe. Energy markets begin to react to the possibility of disruption. Insurance costs rise. Shipping companies reconsider their routes. Even the perception of risk can have enormous economic consequences. When these pressures accumulate, they begin to affect the broader financial system connected to the Gulf economies. Remember that the wealth generated by oil exports does not remain in the region. A large portion of that wealth is reinvested globally. It flows into financial markets, infrastructure projects, and major investments abroad. If the stability of the Gulf region is threatened, those financial flows may begin to slow or change direction. And that is precisely why the conflict is so significant for the global economic economic order. The Gulf states function as a crucial link in the chain that connects oil production, global energy markets, and the financial system centered around the United States dollar. Disruptions in that chain could have far-reaching consequences. Now, when analysts try to understand how far this conflict might escalate, they often turn to a concept from strategic studies known as the game of chicken. In this model, two drivers race toward each other at high speed. The driver who swerves first is considered the loser, but if neither driver swerves, both vehicles